Tonight, we're diving into something truly disturbing. The Middle Ages were full of strange beliefs, but nothing gets weirder than their hygiene myths. People bathed in filth to stay healthy. They drank their own urine as medicine, and some even believed that washing too much could kill you. But before we begin, if you enjoy bizarre myth stories like this, feel free to support the channel with a free subscription. And tell me, where are you watching from right now? I read every comment. It's always wild to see people tuning in from all over the world. Now take a deep breath and relax. This is Myth Night, where you relax and I tell you myth stories. And if you fall asleep before it ends, that's okay. Some myths were meant to be finished in dreams, in the flickering shadows of candlelight, where whispers of the past still linger in drafty stone chambers. There lived beliefs so strange, so utterly foreign to our modern minds, that they seem born from fever dreams, rather than the daily lives of our ancestors. Picture, if you will, a nobleman's chamber in the year 1347. The morning light filters through narrow windows, casting long shadows across rushes scattered on the floor. Lord Edmund rises from his bed, and his servant approaches with a basin of steaming water. But the Lord waves it away with a gesture of genuine terror. "Away with that devil's brew," he whispers, his voice trembling. "Would you see me dead before the week is through?" For you see, in those distant days, they believed with absolute certainty that water was not a cleanser, but a gateway for disease itself. The very act of bathing, they thought, opened the pores of the skin like tiny doorways, allowing sickness to march directly into the body's fortress. So the myth goes that cleanliness was not next to godliness, but rather a foolish invitation to death. The learned physicians of the time would nod gravely as they explained their reasoning. The body, they would say, stroking their beards with the confidence of men who had never doubted their own wisdom. The body maintains its health through a delicate balance of humors. Hot water disrupts this sacred equilibrium, weakening the flesh and making it vulnerable to the pestilence that lurks in every shadow. And so Lord Edmund, like countless others of his station, went years, sometimes decades, without feeling water touch his skin. Instead, he would change his linen undergarments, believing that the cloth would absorb the impurities of his body like a sponge, soaking up spilled wine. They called this dry cleaning, though it bore no resemblance to anything we might recognize today. But the absence of water did not mean the absence of all cleansing rituals. Oh no, for medieval minds were nothing if not inventive in their pursuit of what they believed to be purity. In the shadowed corners of the castle, where servants whispered their secrets, there lived another belief so peculiar that modern minds can barely comprehend it. They believed, and believed with the fervor of religious conviction, that human urine possessed miraculous cleansing properties. Picture young Margaret, a servant girl with calloused hands and hopeful eyes, standing before a polished metal mirror in her mistress's chamber. She holds in her hand a small clay pot, still warm from its recent collection. With careful precision, she dips a rough cloth into the golden liquid and begins to scrub her teeth with the dedication of a monk at prayer. "It whitens them," she whispers to herself, the words her grandmother had spoken echoing in her mind. "It whitens them and keeps the rot away." And indeed, her grandmother had not been entirely wrong. Urine, with its natural ammonia content, did possess certain cleansing properties. But the medieval mind, lacking our understanding of chemistry, attributed this effectiveness to mystical forces. They believed that since urine came from within the body, it contained the essence of life itself, capable of purifying whatever it touched. In the grand halls, where nobles gathered for their evening meals, serving boys would collect the chamber pots not for disposal, but for distribution. The steward would carefully allocate this precious resource, the finest specimens reserved for cleaning delicate fabrics, the rest used for scrubbing floors and washing linens. But perhaps most shocking of all was the practice among the wealthy merchants' wives, who would rinse their hair in aged urine, believing it would make their tresses shine like spun gold. They would sit patiently as their servants poured the amber liquid through their hair, breathing through their mouths to avoid the overwhelming scent, all in pursuit of beauty as they understood it. The irony, lost on them entirely, was that in their quest to avoid the dangers of water, they had embraced something far more hazardous to their health. But such is the way of myths. They blind us to truths that seem obvious in hindsight, while convincing us that our follies are wisdom. As the seasons turned and plagues swept through villages like wildfire, the people sought ever more desperate means of protection. In their terror, they turned to remedies that would make even the bravest soul recoil. Deep in the forests that bordered the great cities, where wise women gathered herbs under the light of the full moon, there emerged beliefs about protective talismans that defy all logic. These women, revered as healers and feared as witches, would prepare amulets designed to ward off the pestilence that claimed lives with ruthless efficiency. In a dimly lit hovel on the outskirts of London, old Griselda works by the light of a single tallow candle. Her gnarled fingers move with practiced precision as she prepares what she believes to be the most powerful protection against disease. Before her, on a rough wooden table, lies a collection that would make modern stomachs turn. Fresh horse dung, still steaming in the cool evening air, the corpse of a mouse caught just that morning, and various other organic materials that shall remain unnamed. The power, she mutters to herself as she works, her voice crackling like autumn leaves. The power lies not in sweet-smelling herbs, but in the essence of life and death intertwined. With reverent care, she wraps these offerings in small scraps of blessed cloth, creating pouches that nobles and peasants alike will wear close to their hearts. The logic, as they understood it, was beautifully simple. Disease was attracted to pleasant scents and repelled by foul ones. Therefore, the more offensive the smell, the greater the protection. Children would be sent to school wearing necklaces strung with these aromatic charms, their small faces scrunched against the overwhelming odor, but their parents sleeping peacefully, believing their little ones were shielded from harm. Merchants would conduct business with dead rats sewn into the linings of their coats. Priests would deliver sermons with pouches of animal waste hidden beneath their holy vestments. The wealthy, not content with simple animal remains, would commission elaborate amulets filled with combinations of substances so vile that they required special servants, paid extra wages for their suffering, to handle and maintain them. Lady Catherine of Pembroke was said to wear a golden locket containing the desiccated heart of a toad, refreshed monthly with fresh bat droppings, believing it made her immune to all earthly diseases. But perhaps the most tragic irony was that in their determination to surround themselves with death, to ward off death, they often hastened their own demise. The very amulets they wore with such faith became breeding grounds for the bacteria and parasites that truly threatened their health. Yet still they persisted, generation after generation, passing down these beliefs like precious heirlooms, each convinced that their ancestors' wisdom was the only thing standing between them and the grave. Even more peculiar than their fear of water and their embrace of foul-smelling talismans was their relationship with the very air they breathed. For in those distant times, they believed that illness traveled not through touch or contaminated water, but through invisible clouds of corruption that they called miasma, bad air that carried death on its wings. In the great city of Paris, during the terrible summer of 1348, when the pestilence claimed so many lives that wagons rolled through the streets each dawn, collecting bodies like a grotesque harvest, the surviving citizens lived in mortal terror of catching a whiff of something unpleasant. Master Guillaume, a prosperous wool merchant, stands at his window overlooking the cobbled street below. In his hand, he holds a leather pouch filled with dried roses, cinnamon bark, and precious cloves, a fortune in spices that could feed a family for months. But Master Guillaume is not thinking of profit. He presses the pouch to his nose with the desperate intensity of a drowning man grasping for air. The corruption comes on the wind. He whispers to his wife, his words muffled by the aromatic barrier he has constructed. One breath of foul air, and we shall follow our neighbors to the grave. And so he ventured forth into the world, armed with his pomander, breathing only through the sweet-scented herbs, believing that pleasant fragrances could form an invisible shield around his body. The irony, lost on the good merchant, was that while he feared the natural sense of a living city, he had no understanding of the true invisible threats that surrounded him. The wealthy developed elaborate rituals around this belief. They would hire servants whose sole responsibility was to walk ahead of them, burning incense and scattering flower petals to purify the air before their masters breathed it. Physicians would refuse to treat patients unless the sick room was first filled with smoke from burning herbs, believing that the smoke would drive out the corrupted air that caused illness. Children were taught from an early age to hold their breath when passing by stables, tanneries, or any place where strong odors lingered. Young lovers would meet in rose gardens, not for romance alone, but because they believed the sweet air would protect them from the diseases that claimed so many of their peers. But the most elaborate precautions were taken during funeral processions. Mourners would walk behind the deceased, wearing masks filled with aromatic herbs, their faces hidden behind grotesque beaks stuffed with spices, looking like some bizarre flock of terrestrial birds. They believed that grief itself could corrupt the air, making it dangerous to breathe in the presence of death. The wealthy would construct special chambers in their homes, rooms sealed against outside air, filled with braziers burning precious woods and herbs, where they could retreat when the threat of bad air became too great. Some nobles became so fearful that they refused to leave these perfumed sanctuaries for months at a time, breathing only air that had been purified through their elaborate filtration systems. Yet while they lived in terror of invisible miasma, they paid no heed to the very real sources of contamination that surrounded them daily: the open sewers running past their front doors, the spoiled food at their own tables, the rats that scurried freely through their bedchambers. In their desperate attempts to control the uncontrollable, they created rituals so complex and expensive that only the wealthy could afford them, leaving the poor to face the mysterious threats of bad air with nothing but prayer and hope. Speaking of the wealthy and their peculiar relationship with cleanliness, perhaps no myth was more persistent than their belief about the dangers of removing body hair. In an age where razors were crude and infections common, they developed a fascinating philosophy that transformed necessity into virtue. In the private chambers of Castle Ravenscroft, where tapestries depicted scenes of legendary hunts and heroic battles, Lord Richard sits before his dressing table as his body servant approaches with a freshly stropped razor. But the Lord raises his hand in warning, his face grave with concern. Think you I am some weak-willed monk who has forgotten the source of a man's strength? He asks, his voice carrying the authority of generations of noble blood. The hair upon a man's body is not mere decoration, it is the very essence of his vitality. For they believed, with the certainty of those who have never questioned inherited wisdom, that hair was not simply a byproduct of the body's function, but a reservoir of spiritual and physical power. Remove it, they thought, and you would drain away the very essence that made a man strong, virile, and capable of facing life's challenges. This belief extended far beyond simple vanity. Medieval physicians taught that hair acted like tiny antennae, drawing strength from the air around the body and channeling it inward. Remove these natural conduits, they warned, and a man would become as weak as a newborn child, vulnerable to every disease, every temptation, every failure of will. The Church, always ready to find moral instruction in physical phenomena, embraced this belief with enthusiasm. They preached that God had placed hair upon the human body as a sign of divine favor, and to remove it was to reject the Creator's design. Monks who shaved their heads did so as an act of deliberate humiliation, a way of weakening themselves in service to God. Women, too, were subject to these beliefs, though their restrictions took different forms. A lady's long hair was considered not merely beautiful, but essential to her health and fertility. Cutting it short was thought to cause barrenness, while shaving it entirely would supposedly drive a woman to madness. Noble ladies would spend hours each day brushing and tending their hair, not from vanity alone, but from the sincere belief that their very lives depended upon it. The most elaborate beliefs surrounded the hair of warriors. Knights would refuse to trim their beards before battle, convinced that each whisker contained a portion of their courage and skill at arms. Some warriors never cut their hair at all, allowing it to grow into great manes that they wore like armor made of their own vitality. There were, of course, practical considerations behind some of these beliefs. In an age without proper antiseptics, shaving often led to infection and death. But the medieval mind, preferring mystical explanations to mundane ones, transformed this practical wisdom into elaborate mythologies about the spiritual properties of hair. Even more extreme were the nobles who, following the logic of their beliefs to its ultimate conclusion, stopped washing their hair entirely. If hair was a conduit for spiritual power, they reasoned, then surely washing it would weaken that power by removing the natural oils and essences that accumulated over time. Lady Marguerite of Brittany became legendary for her devotion to this principle. She went 37 years without washing her hair, allowing it to become a vast, matted creation that required 3 servants to maintain and smelled, according to contemporary accounts, like a combination of old cheese and rotting flowers. Yet she was admired throughout the court for her obvious spiritual strength and was consulted on matters of great importance, her unwashed locks seen as proof of her connection to divine wisdom. But of all the medieval beliefs about cleanliness and purity, perhaps none was more elaborate than their approach to perfume and artificial scenting. Denied the use of water for cleaning their bodies, The wealthy turned to fragrances with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. In the perfumed chambers of Versailles, centuries before it became famous for its opulence, early French nobles developed scenting rituals that would make modern perfumers weep with envy or horror, depending on their sensibilities. Madame Isabel sits at her dressing table as her personal perfumer, a mysterious Italian woman known only as La Nez, the nose, prepares the day's aromatic arsenal. Before them lies an array of substances that defies imagination. Ambergris, harvested from the intestines of sperm whales, musk extracted from the glands of deer, civet from the anal sacs of African cats, and dozens of other animal secretions that modern minds would find revolting. Today, Lanez announces, with the solemnity of a priest preparing communion, we shall layer the lotus base with 7 distinct animal essences, topped with rose absolute and finished with a hint of something special. The something special often included ingredients that would horrify health inspectors today. Crushed pearls were mixed with wine and applied to pulse points. Ground unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, was dissolved in rosewater and dabbed behind the ears. Some nobles even applied mixtures containing small amounts of mercury, believing it would give their skin a luminous glow. But perhaps most shocking was their use of human scents as perfume bases. Wealthy women would collect the sweat of young, healthy peasant boys, believing it contained the essence of youth and vitality. This virgin perspiration was then mixed with expensive floral oils and worn as perfume, the ultimate luxury combining the rare and the revolting. The process of daily scenting could take hours. Nobles would be anointed from head to toe with different fragrances for different parts of their bodies. Their hair might smell of jasmine, their necks of sandalwood, their hands of bitter orange, and their feet of patchouli. The combined effect was often overwhelming. Visiting dignitaries sometimes fainted from the aromatic assault. But the true mark of nobility was the ability to maintain these scenting rituals for years without ever washing the base layers away. The most admired aristocrats were those who had built up such complex aromatic deposits that their very presence could perfume an entire room. Lord Gaston the Fragrant was said to leave a trail of scent so strong that servants could track his movements through the castle hours after he had passed. The expense was astronomical. A single day's worth of perfumes for a high-ranking noble could cost more than a peasant family would see in a lifetime. Entire trade routes were established to bring exotic scenting materials from Asia and Africa, and wars were fought over access to the most prized aromatic resources. Yet underneath all this elaborate scenting lay a truth too terrible for the nobles to acknowledge. They were slowly poisoning themselves with the very substances they believed were protecting them. Many of the exotic ingredients they applied so liberally contained toxins that accumulated in their bodies over years of use, causing mysterious illnesses that no physician could diagnose or cure. But perhaps the most poignant tragedy was that in their quest to avoid the dangers of simple water, they created aromatic prisons that isolated them from genuine human contact. Their own families could barely tolerate their overwhelming scents, and servants were known to request transfers rather than work closely with the most heavily perfumed nobles. As disturbing as the bathing avoidance and aromatic obsessions of adults were, perhaps even more heartbreaking were the beliefs surrounding the care of newborn children. In those distant times, when infant mortality claimed so many tiny lives that parents often waited months, before naming their children, the rituals of newborn care were shrouded in superstition and desperate hope. In a manor house outside Canterbury, where spring rain patters against diamond-paned windows, Lady Margaret cradles her newborn son against her breast. The child is barely an hour old, still red and wrinkled from his journey into the world, when the midwife approaches with a pewter cup filled with wine. "For the cleansing, my lady," the midwife says, her voice carrying the weight of tradition handed down through countless generations. "Water would weaken his spirit, but wine will make him strong." And so begins a ritual that would seem shocking to modern parents, the wine baptism. They believed that water, which they feared for its supposed ability to open the body's defenses, was particularly dangerous for newborns whose spiritual defenses had not yet developed. Wine, however, with its divine associations and natural preservative qualities, was thought to both cleanse and protect. The midwife dips a soft cloth into the wine and begins to gently wash the infant's skin, starting with his forehead and working downward. But this is no gentle cleansing. This is a spiritual armor being applied. They believed that the wine would create an invisible barrier around the child, protecting him from the evil spirits that were thought to be especially attracted to new life. But the wine baptism was only the beginning. For the first month of life, the child would never feel plain water touch his skin. Instead, various alcoholic preparations were used for all cleaning purposes. His mouth would be cleaned with watered wine, his body bathed in wine mixed with herbs. Even his soiled swaddling clothes would be rinsed in wine before being dried and reused. The wealthy took these practices to even greater extremes. Noble families would use only the finest vintages for their newborn's care, believing that the quality of the wine would influence the child's future character. Some even commissioned special blessing wines from monasteries, convinced that divine intervention would provide extra protection for their heirs. The tragic irony was that these wine washes, while avoiding the bacterial contamination that might lurk in medieval water supplies, often contained their own dangers. The alcohol could irritate the delicate skin of newborns, and the herb additives sometimes included plants that were toxic to infants. Many babies developed rashes and breathing problems that their parents attributed to evil spirits rather than to their own well-meaning care. Even more bizarre were the secondary beliefs that surrounded newborn hygiene. They thought that cutting a baby's fingernails before the age of 1 year would cause the child to become a thief, so tiny hands were left to grow talons that often scratched the infant's own face. They believed that washing a baby's hair before it could walk would wash away its intelligence, leaving children with matted, dirty locks that became breeding grounds for parasites. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all was their belief about crying infants. When babies wailed, as babies do, parents were often advised not to clean or comfort them too quickly, because tears were thought to be the soul's way of expelling evil influences. A crying baby was a baby being spiritually purified, and to interfere with this process by cleaning them or changing their clothes too soon might trap the evil inside. These beliefs created a paradox that tormented medieval parents. Their love for their children drove them to follow practices they believed would protect their little ones. But these same practices often caused the very suffering they sought to prevent. Yet so powerful were these inherited beliefs that questioning them was unthinkable. To do so would mean admitting that countless generations of ancestors had been wrong. And in a world where tradition was the only source of security, such doubt was more terrifying than any physical discomfort. But of all the medieval misconceptions about cleanliness and health, perhaps none was more public or more revealing of their fundamental misunderstanding of hygiene than their approach to communal waste disposal and the mystical significance they attributed to it. In the great cities of Europe, where thousands of people lived crowded together within defensive walls, the management of human waste became not just a practical necessity, but a spiritual ritual wrapped in elaborate beliefs about purification and community health. In the city of York, where the shambles twisted through narrow streets and the cathedral spire reached toward heaven like a stone prayer, the public latrines served a purpose far beyond mere sanitation. These communal facilities, built over flowing streams or positioned to empty into rivers, were seen as places of both physical and spiritual cleansing. Master Thomas, a baker whose hands are always dusted with flour and whose back aches from years of bending over his ovens, makes his way to the public latrine on Coppergate just as the cathedral bells ring prime. But he does not go alone, nor does he go simply to answer nature's call. In his hand, he carries a small leather pouch containing what he believes to be sacred herbs, actually weeds gathered from the churchyard, that he will burn while completing his business. For they believed, with touching sincerity, that the act of eliminating waste was also an opportunity to eliminate spiritual impurities from the soul. The public latrine was not merely a place of necessity, but a place of meditation and moral cleansing. The wealthy merchants and guild masters would gather in these facilities at specific hours, turning waste elimination into a social and spiritual ritual. They would sit side by side on the wooden benches, discussing business and philosophy, while believing that their shared vulnerability was purifying their souls of pride and pretension. But perhaps most extraordinary was their belief in the protective power of communal waste itself. They thought that the collected excrement of the righteous could form a barrier against evil influences. Cities would carefully manage their waste disposal, not just for health reasons they didn't understand, but because they believed that maintaining large quantities of human waste within the city walls would protect the entire population from supernatural threats. The logic, as they understood it, was beautifully medieval in its complexity. Humans were God's chosen creatures, and therefore their waste, while unpleasant, contained traces of divine blessing. Concentrate enough of this blessed material in one place, and you create a spiritual fortress that demons and diseases cannot penetrate. This belief led to elaborate waste management rituals that seem almost incomprehensible today. Monastery latrines were considered especially powerful, and some cities would pay handsomely for cartloads of monastic waste to mix with their own, believing it would enhance the protective qualities of their communal deposits. The most devout practitioners would spend hours in the public latrines, not from physical necessity, but from spiritual devotion. They believed that prolonged exposure to communal waste would gradually purify their souls, burning away pride, greed, and other sins through what they considered to be holy humiliation. Women, generally excluded from most public rituals, found in the communal latrines one of the few places where they could participate in community spiritual practices. Noble ladies would disguise themselves as common women to join in these sessions, sitting shoulder to shoulder with merchants' wives and servant girls, all united in their belief that shared elimination was shared purification. The irony, of course, was that these communal waste facilities were breeding grounds for every disease they feared. By concentrating human waste and encouraging people to spend extended time in close proximity to it, they created perfect conditions for the spread of cholera, dysentery, and countless other illnesses. Yet their faith in the spiritual benefits was so strong that even when these facilities became obvious sources of disease, they attributed the illnesses to insufficient devotion rather than to the practices themselves. Some cities developed competitive waste accumulation, each trying to build larger and more spiritually powerful communal deposits than their neighbors. The city of Lincoln became famous throughout England for its massive latrine complex, which could accommodate over 100 people simultaneously, and was considered so spiritually significant that pilgrims would travel from across Europe just to participate in its purifying rituals. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of these beliefs was how they prevented the development of genuine sanitation systems. Because they attributed mystical significance to waste accumulation, they actively resisted efforts to remove or properly process human waste, viewing such attempts as spiritual vandalism that would leave their communities defenseless against supernatural threats. Even more devastating than their beliefs about communal waste was their understanding of disease itself. In a world where the true causes of illness remained hidden, medieval minds created elaborate mythologies that transformed sickness from a biological phenomenon into a moral judgment passed down from heaven itself. In the scriptorium of Glastonbury Abbey, where monks labored by candlelight to preserve the wisdom of ages past, Brother Francis sets down his quill and rubs his tired eyes. For weeks now, a fever has been spreading through the monastery, claiming the lives of his fellow brothers with ruthless efficiency. But Brother Francis does not think of contagion or contamination. Instead, he examines his soul for the sins that have surely brought this divine punishment upon their community. The corruption comes from within, he whispers to himself, his voice barely audible above the scratch of quills and the rustling of parchment. Our hearts have harbored pride, and now the Lord cleanses us with suffering. For they believed, with the absolute certainty of those who have never questioned divine justice, that physical illness was nothing more than the external manifestation of spiritual contamination. A man who fell sick with fever was not the victim of bacteria or virus, but a sinner whose inner corruption had finally become visible to the world. This belief created a cruel logic that tormented both the sick and those who loved them. If disease was divine punishment, then helping the afflicted too much might be interfering with God's will. If recovery was possible, it could only come through moral purification, not medical intervention. The physicians of the time, such as they were, became spiritual counselors as much as healers. They would examine not just the patient's body, but their entire life history, searching for the particular sins that had caused their current suffering. A merchant with consumption might be told that his illness stemmed from charging unfair prices. A woman with fever might be convinced that her vanity had brought divine retribution. But perhaps most heartbreaking was how this belief affected families. Parents watching their children waste away from diseases they could not understand were forced to search their own souls for the sins that had cursed their innocent babies. The guilt was often more devastating than the illness itself. The church, naturally, embraced and elaborated upon these beliefs. They taught that certain sins caused specific diseases. Pride led to skin conditions that made one hideous to look upon. Greed caused wasting diseases that consumed the body from within. Lust brought forth fevers that burned away the sinner's vitality. The more visible and embarrassing the illness, the more public and shameful the sin must have been. This led to elaborate rituals of public confession and penance for the sick. Patients would be required to stand before their entire community and confess every sin they could remember, hoping that complete honesty would convince God to lift their affliction. The wealthy could purchase indulgences to reduce their spiritual debt, but the poor had no choice but to endure both their illness and the public shame of whatever sins they were believed to have committed. Some diseases were considered so spiritually significant that they became marks of honor rather than shame. Leprosy, because it so completely separated the sufferer from normal life, was sometimes viewed as a special form of divine testing, and lepers were occasionally revered as holy figures whose suffering brought them closer to Christ. But this spiritual interpretation of disease also led to some of the most cruel and ineffective treatments imaginable. Patients were subjected to elaborate purification rituals that often made their conditions worse. They were denied food and water as penance for their sins. They were forced to sleep on cold stone floors to mortify their flesh. They were beaten with holy relics to drive out the demons they believed were causing their symptoms. The tragic irony was that many of these spiritual treatments actually accelerated death. Patients who might have recovered with rest and nourishment instead died from the harsh penances imposed upon them. Yet their deaths were often celebrated as evidence of divine mercy. The suffering had purified their souls, allowing them to enter heaven despite their earthly sins. Even more elaborate were the preventive rituals designed to maintain spiritual purity and thus avoid disease entirely. Noble families would commission private chapels where they could confess their sins daily, believing that regular spiritual cleansing would protect them from physical illness. Some developed complex systems of moral accounting, carefully tracking their good and evil deeds to maintain a positive spiritual balance. The wealthy could afford to hire personal confessor physicians who would monitor both their physical symptoms and their spiritual state, providing customized penance prescriptions designed to prevent specific diseases. A merchant worried about fever might be advised to give extra alms to the poor. A knight concerned about battle wounds might be told to spend additional hours in prayer. But perhaps most revealing of all was how these beliefs affected their understanding of recovery. When someone did heal from a serious illness, it was never attributed to their body's natural resilience or to effective treatment. Instead, recovery was seen as proof that the patient's sins had been forgiven, that their suffering had successfully purified their soul. This created a particularly cruel paradox for chronic sufferers. If their illness persisted, despite elaborate spiritual treatments, it meant their sins were so great that they had not yet earned forgiveness. The sicker they became, the more sinful they must be, and the more intensive their spiritual treatments needed to become. As the night deepens and these ancient beliefs swirl around us like shadows cast by dying embers, we begin to see how desperately our ancestors struggled to understand forces they could not control. In their desire to make sense of suffering and death, they created elaborate mythologies that were often more harmful than the diseases they sought to prevent. Yet perhaps there was a strange comfort in believing that illness had meaning, that suffering served a purpose, that death itself was not random, but part of some vast moral order. In a world where life was short and pain was constant, The idea that everything happened for a reason, even if that reason was divine punishment, might have been easier to bear than acknowledging the terrifying randomness of existence. And so they carried their protective amulets filled with animal waste, avoided the life giving properties of clean water, perfumed themselves with substances that slowly poisoned their bodies, and subjected the sick to treatments that hastened their deaths, all in the sincere belief that they were protecting themselves and their loved ones from forces too terrible to face unprepared. In the pre dawn darkness, when the last candle burns low and the first birds begin their tentative songs, we can almost hear the whispers of those long dead voices, still insisting that their methods worked, that their beliefs protected them, that their understanding of the world was the only truth worth knowing. Perhaps the most humbling realization is how much of our own modern certainty might seem equally misguided to future generations. How many of our own cherished beliefs about health and cleanliness and protection will seem as quaint and dangerous to our descendants as medieval hygiene practices seem to us? The myths persist, changing form but never quite disappearing, as each generation discovers new ways to transform fear into ritual, uncertainty into dogma, and the simple human desire for protection into elaborate ceremonies that may protect us from everything, except the consequences of our own desperate need to believe we understand more than we do. But maybe, just maybe, not everything they believed was entirely wrong. The narrator's voice fades to a whisper, leaving only the soft crackle of dying embers and the gentle whisper of wind through ancient stones, as sleep finally claims both teller and listener, carrying them into dreams, where the boundaries between wisdom and folly, between protection and peril, blur like shadows dancing in the dying light of a medieval hearth.